Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. So just sit back and relax, and we'll be right with you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Good to see you back again for another workshop with us. For those that don't know me, my name is Michael Ibrahim. I'm program manager with the Cultural Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. And our focus in the Cultural Investment Portfolio is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations, which brings us to our session today, strategic budgeting and scenario planning. This workshop is part of our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we've been offering 2 free workshops every week in the areas of legal issues, human resources, advocacy, management, board governance, and then our series with the Nonprofit Finance Fund on financial management. Joining us today from the Nonprofit Finance Fund is Annie Chang. We're going to get started in just in a moment, but a few ground rules as we get going today. If you want to say hi in the chat with the name of your organization, feel free to do so. Sometimes it's hard in a webinar to kind of make community, but if you want to say hi, you're welcome. This session, as all Mass Cultural Council webinars and meetings, has automatic captioning. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation at a future workshop, just let us know when you register. We will have time for questions throughout the session today like we normally do. So we ask you to please use the Q&A function of Zoom that helps us keep everything organized, and Annie can look at all the questions and answer them in real time. We'll reserve the chat. My colleague Sarah is here, and she's going to put some resources, including the presentation that we have today, in the chat so you can follow along at home if you'd like. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel probably tomorrow, and you're going to get an email when all of that is ready and available for you. This session is an hour, and that includes time for questions and answers. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Annie.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to the Massachusetts Cultural Council for having Nonprofit Finance Fund. And thanks to everyone who joined today. It looks like we have about 14 attendees. As Michael shared, this is webinar number 7. We're going to be talking about strategic budgeting and scenario planning. Before we join, we just wanted to acknowledge that folks are joining this call from different parts of Massachusetts in a virtual space, and we want to take a moment to honor the land that we are each joining from and acknowledge that this land that we inhabit was stolen from Indigenous community. Today, I'm joining you all from Pasadena, California, the native home of the Tongva people. I invite you to share in the chat the Indigenous territory that you are joining us from. If you do not know the territory, you can click on the link that we are sharing in the chat and look it up. As NFF is on our journey to be an anti-racist organization with a central strategy to increase our partnerships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led and serving organizations, we are integrating Indigenous land acknowledgements as appropriate into our sessions. At NFF, we're seeking to include voices that were previously excluded. We strive to bravely face the facts of this history, no matter how painful. I hope this acknowledgement continues to build and expand on our understanding of our world, and I invite you to learn more about the Native people in each of your respective territories that you're joining from today. Thank you for sharing that, everyone. With that, let's take 3 deep breaths. I know folks are joining from different things today, and we'll continue on our session. Okay. A little bit more about Nonprofit Finance Fund. I think some of you have joined from previous webinars, so you're probably familiar with NFF already, but just for those who are new, we are a 40-year-old nonprofit organization. We are a community development financial institution that provides lending to nonprofit organizations as well as advisory services to nonprofit leaders. And we lift up what we learn to advocate for the communities that we're working within. And I'm joining you today from our advisory services practice. With that, what's this session about today? As I was preparing for this session, I was thinking about the questions of a lot of the leaders that I work with, and the things that we're going to try to answer and focus on today is for folks that have questions like thinking about the many ways that this year could go, and how do I plan around that uncertainty of the different things that could happen this year. Maybe not being sure of whether your fundraisers or your development efforts are going to bring in as much revenue as you hope. How do I plan around that? And there's some critical questions we have about how we're going to do our work this year, thinking about at what point do I make those decisions and pull those triggers for increasing our expenses, maybe by hiring more staff to increase the demand we may see this year. These are all things that I'm thinking about coming into the session. I'm curious if there's other questions that folks are entering the space with, and you can feel free to put that in the chat. And I'll ask Michael if anything's coming up to share that with the group.
I'm not seeing anything yet, but I'm sure we'll add to as we go along.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So hopefully that means these are everyone's in the right place, and these are the things that are top of mind for you all. So as you're thinking about those things, the goals for today's 1 hour that we'll be together is to be able to use your budget strategically to identify and prepare for risks and opportunities. And we'll be sharing a couple of examples around that hopefully will be really tangible for you to walk away from today in your planning efforts. To enhance visibility so that you can make decisions in a nimble way across and with different stakeholders within your organization and your partners. And to, sorry, this is not worded right, navigate through scenario planning for your organization. With that, we're gonna run a first poll to just try to see how comfortable folks are with your organization's budget right now. And I think Michael's going to help us run this poll to get a quick pulse check. Really 0 being no experience. You're really entering the space trying to learn about budgeting. Maybe 1 is at a beginner level and 5 is really like advanced proficient and just trying to learn a couple more things on what is already a really great skill set that I use at this moment. Great. Looks like we have about 15 out of 16 folks. I think we can close that now, Michael. It looks like most folks are around the middle, but we see that we do have a range of how folks are entering today. So I think this will be good to kind of meet folks across the different ways that you're entering today, and appreciate folks with more advanced skills that hopefully you'll walk away with some new ways thinking about budgeting and strategic planning. But that, we are also here to offer some foundational understanding for folks across the different ways that we're entering in. Hopefully that was helpful for everyone to see. I'm going to close mine, keep going. Before we start on some of the more tangible things around strategic budgeting, we want to think about some considerations as we enter into budgeting that is important to keep in mind for everyone, that really a budget is a plan that's expressed in dollars for your organization. It should reflect your strategic goals, set realistic expectations. It thinks about your revenue and the nuances of your revenue, including restrictions. And it also is really meant to identify how you can have surpluses to support your longer term needs. And we'll get into some of that today. It accounts for uncertainty. We all have an uncertainty in our revenue and our expenses. And what we want to offer today is to give yourself permission to be able to make your best estimate and with the information that you have. And we're confident that all of you on the phone have a lot of information about your organization. And this is a moment to think about how we can express that in dollars and our best understanding of what we think could happen. And we're going to specifically visit a way to think about revenue and the uncertainty around revenue today and give you some really tangible tools to plan for that. Knowing your option, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference in expenses and the nuances of expenses and things that are important to think about as you are budgeting and thinking about which ones are ones to keep. And we're going to be clear about what the trade-offs are for making different assumptions within your expenses in scenario planning. And lastly, using the budgeting tool beyond just as a planning tool, but also for monitoring, for tracking yourselves against your goals, moving forward, checking in with it and using it as a communication tool. Those are all important things as we think about strategic budgeting and using the budget as a really great tool for leadership and management. And what goes into your budget? There are some things that are probably at hand for you already that you're already using. Some of these things may be things you want to bring in that you're not currently. A really great starting place is what you already know. So these may be the expenses that you already know that you're going to incur this year. This could be your rent or your mortgage payment that you already know how much is needed for that. And some of the other expenses you have may need some more considerations around what it's going to look like for this year. But there's probably some that you are already fairly certain about this year, as well as funding. There's likely some funding sources that are very certain for you, things that were committed in the past year that are going to carry over into this year, or things that have already been improved and you know what you're going to be working on this year. We want to take a look and bring that information into our budgeting process. The prior year's outcomes, thinking about how did we do last year, knowing that it was the year of COVID and there were some very special circumstances, either in relief dollars you brought in or in ways that your organization wasn't able to bring in revenue because of the stay-at-home orders. And so thinking about the nuance of that as we look at what our best estimate is for this year. The strategic goals you have, what it is that you hope to accomplish. It's going to be really important to align with your financial plan. And we offer that finances are a way to get to our mission. It's not just about the dollars, but it's about what we can achieve. And holding those in your mind as you do budgeting is really helpful to prioritize where you're going to be spending money. And that may include strategic plans or other types of analysis that you all have done or plans that you've made with your team and your board, I should say, as well as staff input from across the organization, having buy-in across the organization for what the priorities are for those that are closest to the programming and the work that you do is a really great way to inform your budget and have a plan that really lives out the goals from across your organization. So this is a format of a budget that you all are likely familiar with and has been shown on other webinars as well. What I wanted to share here is just a revisit that each of these items on your budget have certain nuances that's important to keep in mind as we plan our budgets, both on the revenue side, on the expense side, and in planning for a surplus or a deficit. For revenue dynamics, we want to think about how is your organization generating the dollars that it needs to support its mission? What of it feels reliable or at risk? And how do we identify that in our assumptions when we plan our budget for the next year? And the expense dynamics, how is the organization spending its money? Likely for a lot of you all, the biggest cost is around people. That's oftentimes how nonprofits accomplish their mission. And we want to think about what that means when it's expressed in dollars and where folks are and how we're compensating folks. But also, you know, if there are other things that are predictable, things that are unpredictable that you may not be aware of, being able to think about the assumptions behind each of our expenses and take note of that as we're budgeting, so we remember why we thought things were going to be what we planned, and we can hold that as we go through the year to understand what our assumptions were as of May of 2021. And how can we be responsive? Which of these expenses are items that are levers for us if there is a change throughout the year? And lastly, planning for profitability and savings. Are we planning for a surplus that is sufficient to support our balance sheet needs, our longer term needs, any desire to have a reserve? Are we planning for a deficit because we know we have the funds on hand to be able to support that? And this year is a really mission critical year. So that ending point of a surplus or a deficit, it's important to understand the assumptions behind that and to have assumptions behind that also, so that you can clearly tell your financial story. So I offer this in thinking about the budgeting process. What we want to be able to do is within the revenue, expenses, and surplus deficit to articulate your assumptions. We often do that by adding a notes column in your budget template, so that you can say why you thought this was going to come in at the amount that it was. Identify any of the risks or potential swings so you can remember this was a place where we weren't sure, if our gala was going to bring in as many people this year because it may still have to be virtual, and being able to take notes and see where those risks are, as well as identifying what you have control over and what you don't. If there are funding sources that are really things that you've done your best and it's really not up to you anymore whether it comes in or not, then that's important to note. If there is funding sources that are more generated through your work, maybe in development and writing your end of year letter, and there is something that can be said about how much it takes for you to do that, and you have a little bit more control over, or even the timing of those fundraisers too, it's important to identify that to know where your decision points are. On that point, one of the things that we get asked the most about at NFF is about, at this moment especially, is around revenue and understanding the unpredictability of revenue. And so I think that's a place that we wanted to dig in today and give folks on this call a really specific tool to walk away with for you to account for the uncertainty, especially as there's a year of not sure where some of the relief dollars are going to be this year that may or may not be coming in. For a lot of arts organizations, understanding whether you're going to be able to reopen in person or not, and some of the drivers behind the revenue that's associated with that. So we're going to offer a tool on how to account for the uncertainty in revenue. And then in the scenario planning portion that comes next after this, offer an example around those different situations you may be trying to understand what the impact is going to be. So how do we account for the uncertainty in different revenue sources? One way that NFF offers this is really getting a list together around your potential revenue sources and confirmed revenue sources, and having a list of all of these things. They may even just be funding partners or donors or individual supporters that you've heard of are supportive of your mission and could be aligned with you. People have shared with you that maybe this is a place where you want to think about reaching out to, but you're just not sure. And there may be other partners who have funded you in the past and you have more certainty around that. Making a full list of that and understanding the likelihood of receiving funding from each of them is a first step in helping to really write down our assumptions behind our revenue sources. And this can help you to make a data-informed financial projection of potential revenue. And we're going to walk through how. I've also had folks ask me, how do I understand how likely I am to receive funding from a funding source? And so I just wanted to offer some questions that we typically coach leaders with when they're understanding their different revenue sources. And so I just laid them out here. I'm going to pause after this to see if there's other questions folks have too, or other ways that you've also assessed your likelihood of revenue from a funder. One of the first ones is, how aligned are we with what this funder funds? Or do we focus on the same issue areas? Are they an arts funder? Are they one that's funding youth justice around arts, and that's the work that we do? Are they funding in a certain geography? Do they have a specific priority? That's the geography that we serve. or are they funding a different geography? And so we're not sure if they're going to really be supportive because we're working with a different community. Target demographics of who you serve and who they're focused on. What types of things have you seen them fund in the past? You might have heard from colleagues or peers, or you might even see from their website other things that they funded in the past. What do we know about the amounts they have granted to others in the past? I've had organizations I work with sometimes ask, what's the amount that I could expect? And we can never know for certain if the request for proposal doesn't have an amount, but you might be able to look at other grants that they've given to get an estimate. And what's our relationship with them? Did they reach out to us, which maybe shows some more interest? Did we blindly reach out to them, which is great because we're strategically aligned, but we don't really have that much of a connection yet? Or are we responding to an open RFP where we know others are applying to also? So I'm going to talk about next how to take some of these assessments of the funding streams and put it into a financial projection. But before I do that, I wanted to see if anyone else has any other thoughts that they would offer when they're thinking about how likely they are to receive funding from a funder. I see that Ellen had a comment around earlier. My question that you're thinking about is how to decide whether to go in person, hybrid, or stay virtual. And we'll talk a little bit about that in scenario planning too. Thank you, Ellen, for that question.
And Annie, we also had another comment of employment, and when someone wants to take on a part-time person, the parameters of actually budgeting someone in their operating budget.
Thank you, Michael. That's a great question. Okay, let's talk a little about the revenue opportunity here first, and then we'll talk about some of those expenses and look in the scenario planning to answer that question that you mentioned, Michael, and Ellen's question too. So when we look at revenue, a way to break it down for ourselves is breaking up that list that I mentioned in the earlier slide into different grades. One of them being committed, like we already have a signed contract for this grant, or the donor has already given us this money, so this is committed. There's a level of B, this proposal submitted, and we're feeling really good about that. There's really high probability because we've had great conversations with the funder, a lot of informational discussions. They've seemed very interested. Like I just have a good gut feeling about it. There's C, which is just in the middle. The proposal submitted. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with it. We haven't gotten a good feeling one way or another. So it's about like 50-50 chance, right? D, we're in discussions with them, but we're not really sure where it's going to go. There's some things that we're not totally aligned on. Maybe we serve a different geography than they're focused on, but there might still be some chance of it. And then there's E, it's a really new relationship, or we're blindly responding to an RFP. So we don't have a lot of certainty, but there's this slim chance it might come through. What we would do with this level of assessment is to turn it into a probability. And here I'm offering 5 different levels of probability. Each of you could have more, be more conservative or not around how likely these sources are. This is one tool to offer as you're thinking about uncertainty. And we know that you'll all take it all for your own and make it your own and how it's applicable. But here I offer 100% probability for committed funds. So we would multiply it by 100, the grant amount. 90% for being pretty reliable. We've received this one example is that historically we've received this grant in the past and the funder is continuing to fund around this. So, we feel fairly confident around it, but not 100%. So it's at 90%. 60% is we're feeling moderately comfortable, 25%, it's really in design phase. There might be a chance that's going to happen. 10%, it's very speculative. We're not really sure where it's going, but there's a slim chance it might be accepted. So this is a way of starting to put a number to the different levels of uncertainty you may feel in your revenue sources. And you could use the same probability around potential donors too, or even about the total amount you're going to receive from your ticket sales, even if you were to put it down into numbers for those of you who do performance art or other things that are ticketed or desiring on earned income. What this turns into is taking that total grant amount and then multiplying it by the probability. And in this case, you can see this government agency source, the contract was signed, it's going to be reimbursed up to 25,000. Reliable Foundation has strong alignment. We don't have any strong concerns about getting this grant again. So it's at 90%. Sometimes major donor has strong alignment, but has kind of been off and on certain years, so we're not sure. New corporation is engaged in this learning. They're engaged, but they're in their own process of learning about the field and trying to see where they want to fund. So we have them at 25%. And then these are just like, overall, we are researching a whole list of potential donors. So out of that whole list, which adds up to 5,000, we feel like 10% of it could come through. So here, the total amount, if they all came in at 100, is 56,000. If we took those discount amounts and we discounted it, then it would be at amount of 45,000. It's not perfect. Some leaders feel that they overall only count revenue that's 100%, which is definitely, you know, if that's your feeling as a leadership manager, then that totally makes sense. What we're offering here is that some of these things may come through fully at 100%, and some of these things may not come in at all. So overall, using this discount methodology gets us a little bit closer to a total revenue source, accounting for that uncertainty in the things that we're pursuing. Another way to do this besides discount methodology is to just cut it off, to say we are only going to count the amounts that are 60% and above. And so if we drew this line, we would come out at 46,000. So it's actually not that far off if we compare to the probability, which I think was at 46,500. So this is an interesting way for you to be able to take some of the things that you're thinking about and put it down into a numeric expression that could get you to maybe a more refined number around your total revenue source. Want to see if there was any questions before we move into expenses on using this tool to project revenue. And I see that Megan had a comment earlier about another factor in receiving funding is if a funder has continually funded you for several years and sometimes they want to take a break, and are you at that cycle? I think that's a really great consideration. And I think that this is coming in here. If you know that that funder is going to have a off year for you every 2 or 3 years, then we count them as maybe 0%, but we want to be sure to track them so that next year we can count them in again. But if we're not certain and there's still a chance they might fund you, then I would say, might be a chance to put them in at a lower probability. Is this a methodology that folks feel could be helpful for you and you might want to try using? Feels a little risky. Yeah, Susan, sure. And Elizabeth, you like capturing everything, but with added probability. Yeah, so, like I shared, I think that there's different ways that folks may feel risk is inherent in accounting for things that are not 100%. It looks like Megan has used this in the past and it's worked well or reliably, and this may help with regular iterations. And I see your comment, Yasmin, to go over the types of funding sources again. Which ways can we go with our current funding sources that are below 60% probable? So yes, absolutely. I think for folks who, really don't want to count their chickens until they're like fully hatched, if that's how the expression goes, then this can feel a little bit as a stretch. But what we offer at NFF is some of these management tools could also just be internal, that this may not necessarily inform your final budget, but putting down these probabilities might help you to get to a more nuanced understanding of what your revenue may be for the year. Knowing that as nonprofits, certain things won't happen that we expect it to happen, but certain new things may happen during the year also. And, this is one tool for you to use as you see is fit for the different revenue sources you have. For Yasmin, I'm just going to go back again towards the different types of funding sources. And just to say that I think the percentages that we are offering here for each level isn't necessarily just tied to the source of the funding, but more around the status or the strength of the relationship and the strength of the strategic alignment. So going back to those questions, I'm going to go back here for a second, around how aligned are you with what the funder funds? What types of things have they funded in the past? What do we know about the amounts they have granted others in the past? What's our relationship? Have they funded us consistently? And we're maybe in the first year of our funding. So we know that they're a funder who funds for multiple years once they find an organization they are really aligned with. So we feel good about them funding us again. So rather than the source of the funding, it's more about the strength of the alignment between you and the funder. Great. Thanks, Yasmin. And those are all really great thoughts for everyone. I appreciate everyone bringing in your personal experiences to, what's essentially an uncertain time and always uncertain for us around revenue. For forecasting expenses, as we think about the expense side of our budget, we often just want to offer having a nuanced understanding around your expenses is helpful in thinking about how you plan for the year. Which ones are more directly within your control, and it's usually more within your control than revenue is. But sometimes some of our expenses are tied to our revenue, right? Like if we're only going to get a certain grant if we do a certain amount of work because of the restrictions. So we want to keep that in mind also. Besides just how expenses can be tied to your revenue, we want to think about whether those expenses are direct or indirect. Are they ones that are tied directly to a program? So if that program continues, then we're going to continue having those expenses. If the program doesn't continue, then we may not see those expenses anymore because we're not doing that work. And which ones are indirect or organizational wide expenses. And a note on indirect, we often get the question of what's the right amount of indirect, and it really depends on your organization, and being able to tell the story about how your indirect expenses support your organization. We think it's problematic for the field to have a benchmark for nonprofit organizations, but really making sure that all those indirect costs are ones that are supporting your mission and you can speak to. Another nuance is around fixed or variable expenses. For fixed expenses, these are the ones that are going to be how much we have to pay no matter how much our work grows or shrinks. So this could be the rent that you are paying. At some point, you may not pay rent if you go virtual, which we've learned last year. But generally, these are the fixed expenses like internet and other things that we know we're going to need no matter how much or little work we're doing. And then the variable expenses are ones that increase or decrease based on your level of activity. And rather than kind of taking last year's numbers and just applying it to this year, having a nuanced understanding, which it sounds like from the comments, a lot of you are doing that careful consideration as you're planning your expenses this year. What we offer here is that it's important as leaders to understand how changing your expenses are going to impact your mission delivery. And for an example, I just offer that there was an organization I worked with where they thought that during a tight year, they would be able to cut some of their administrative support. And they were an arts organization that did youth programming. And what they didn't realize is when they cut their administrative support, that person was not only doing like the office work that was administrative, but they were also making the phone calls to all the parents to make sure that the children attended the classes and signed up for the next season of classes. And so when they let go of that person without that full understanding of the impact, they saw their enrollment numbers drop down. And they thought, that's so weird. Why did our enrollment numbers drop down? And then it came to be after some conversation, understanding the work that that individual was doing to bring in, to support the overall organization. And so we just offer here as you make any changes to really think about and talk to staff about what informs that expense and, what is really the full impact if we were to remove that expense. So something to think about. And overall, a strategic budget is one that quantifies risk and aids in decision making. It's going to allow you to show what happened and why. So if you'll be able to look at the variance between your actuals and your projected numbers. So with all of those assumptions that you have right now, being able to continue to check in on it throughout the year to see if those assumptions are playing out as you thought and the numbers are matching, or perhaps if the numbers aren't matching, what were some of the things that we thought were going to happen and it's changing, and do we need to make other changes in the organization? It seems like from the comments you all are, really closely monitoring and using your budget to monitor, which is great to hear. I think hopefully some of what we offered is going to be able to have you check in on that more and use it as a strategic tool for decision making. Are there other questions? I'll pause here for a moment that anyone wants to ask before we move into using scenario planning, which is really building off of budgeting to make decisions and understand some situations. I'm going to give everyone a minute to post their questions. It looks like Elizabeth's going to post a question. Great. And Michael, I realize I can see the chat, so I'll just continue reading the chats. Is it okay that I think of my org's budget as an evolving document? I think that that is a really great question, especially with how much things are changing right now. And that is definitely something to, I guess it's the question of how you think of it as evolving is something that is definitely true. I think changes are going to happen throughout the year. Having alignment with your board about when you actually want to make a change to the revenue or the expenses in your budget or your plan is a discussion to be made. I think the full understanding that things may not play out as we thought is important. But throughout the year, we have things that we call reforecasting. And that is when you actually come into an agreement that we are really straying, we're not getting the numbers that we thought in participation in some of our programs. And it really feels like our plan is going to put us at a different place at the end of the year. So we want to come together and actually change our plan and make that change. Feels different than monitoring that some things are off track. And that's really up to each organization to decide with your board and leadership of when does it feel like we really need to have a different plan because this year is going to end up differently. Let's see. Who does the budgeting? That's a really great question, Ellen. It depends on the size of the organization. And I would say if you don't have a finance manager or a staff person that is in charge of the budgeting, it is often the executive director that's doing the budgeting. I've worked with organizations that have really strong volunteer boards where there is a board member who supports strongly with the budgeting in the years because there just isn't staff capacity to do that. But having one owner, an identified owner, is really helpful so that that person knows that they're responsible for moving that forward. And the finance committee should definitely be weighing in on that as members of the board to have alignment with what's happening and ultimately as approvers of the budget too. And comment from Susan, our treasurer is extremely risk averse, but the rest of the board is much less so. How can we align our risk tolerance better? That's such a great question. And I wonder if really having everyone talk about the assumptions behind the different numbers that you are putting down as a plan would help, and maybe showing historical data as well. Like I said at the beginning of this session, was that the information you're bringing in to inform this isn't just like wild guesses about how things are going to be. It's somewhat informed by what your experience has been in the past, and perhaps providing this whole story to someone who is more risk averse and doesn't want to anticipate more revenue, then by having all the data there of why you believe that revenue would be at a certain amount might be helpful, and accounting for the different probabilities here and making different situations. You could play with the numbers to make them all at a lower percentage and then see, what is that worst case scenario if none of these things came in, and how would we make decisions too. and try to give them the full picture around that. And that actually is a really good lead into the scenario planning effort, which might be another place to support individuals who just, you might want to bring everyone in more together around what the financial plan is for the organization. And as we move into scenario planning, one more poll question here, if Michael, we can open this poll, is to think about how you are currently planning for this year. And the choices here are number one, we're planning to stay mostly remote for most of 2021. Number two, planning to reopen programs in person on a set date and have decided on what exactly it's going to look like. Number three, we planning to reopen programs in person, but we're not really sure what or when it's going to look like that. And for folks who may be already opening and doing programs primarily in person. Looks like we have about 70%, and I'm going to give it 5 more seconds for everyone to respond. Okay, why don't we close that, Michael? So it looks like we have majority of folks are considering reopening, maybe have already made some plans for reopening, and there is a quarter of folks on the call who are planning to stay remote most of 2021. And maybe one person who's already operating in person, which is really great to hear that there's some movement towards that this year. I think the scenario that we're going to go over today is going to be helpful for you all, since you guys are all in the different situations that we're going to be analyzing. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I think hopefully that worked, Michael. And move into the different scenarios that you may be exploring. And we really think about scenario planning as an opportunity to put down some of the things that as leaders keep you up at night, and the what if questions, like what if this happens, what's going to happen to me, how am I going to make decisions, or also knowing like what if the better situation happens, and we want to be able to support that, and how could that year also end on the high end too. So what we offer here is to really take the things that you're weighing and put it down in a matrix or some kind of methodology and thinking about what your options are. So the two things that we're thinking about for ABC organization is what the pace is going to be of reopening and what the financial impact is going to be. For them, there are two ways that it could go in kind of an extreme circumstance. But I also want to say that the header here is permission to make your best guess. And as leaders, there's a lot of things you're weighing. What we're offering here is permission just to put some things down and to just take the information that you know and to work with that. Although there's a lot of things that are unknown. Let's take what we know. So fast-paced reopening is one option of really that the vaccines happen more quickly within our community. Folks feel more comfortable. Our staff feels more comfortable. We're able to have a plan for reopening, and public health procedures allow us to do that. Slow-paced reopening is perhaps the fears you have that there's going to be another resurgence, that maybe there's going to be a lot of fear still about from the community, and we're just not prepared to reopen in this way yet. And so it's going to look slower in what it looks like for our organization to reopen. And then what's the financial impact around that? Like the financial impact could be like very low, like there may not be much financial impact. Maybe that things will be as they were before because we have the funder support that we need. And if we have any fee for service revenue, that it will come in because we're able to reopen. So there won't be much financial impact. And here, the other side of that is that it could be high financial impact, that perhaps funders don't want to support virtual anymore, that they really want to support live reopening, and we're just not at a place to do that. And I name all these things not because I have any insight into your own work, but that these may be some of the fears or things that you're thinking top of mind for you that it can be unsettling, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep and you have all these thoughts. So let's put them down on paper. Here we have it in a 2x2 matrix. And in this blue side, it's really a best case situation for both, that there's a phased return for ABC organization starting in May this month, and that they're planning for a full return in person in September, and that this is a real option for them. And what would this look like? And that our funding is minimally impacted. We're really going to be able to get through 2021 and start to see returns in 2022 to a normal business model, quote unquote normal business model. And then on the other side of that, if there is a slower pace reopening, that might look like that we're fully remote in 2021, and we may not have even starting a phased return until January 2022. And so the financial impact could be decline in some areas because of this, and we're not able to fully recognize all of our revenue that, or bring in the revenue that we need for this virtual setting. Looking at these two, there's probably a lot of situations in between this that could come up, like what if this, what if that. What we offer is just, again, permission to look at these two situations as the two most likely ones, two that you really want to understand would have the most impact on your organization. And so we take this and we turn it into the financial projection around those. So here we have the sample, the fiscal year 21 budget for the ABC organization. They have a fiscal year of January 1st to December 31st. The dollars are expressed in thousands. We have a section for all the revenue sources, a section for all the expenses. So this is kind of their baseline budget, and it reflects the current operations that has like limited reopening. They put their assumptions down for what they thought could happen in the budget, and made their best understanding. And for them, it is about 4,038,000 in revenue, 4,076,000 in expenses, ending with a deficit of 38,000, a modest deficit. Here in scenario A, they've taken those situation and built it out more. If these things happen, if we fully reopen by September and we have growing service demand, what will be the financial implications of that? And so here we see increased service delivery. So county contracts, we're going to be able to bring in more for that. State contracts, we're going to bring in more for that because we are able to do more in person and folks are feeling more comfortable coming in person. The foundation grants, we would get a rapid response funding grant. This is still kind of a relief fund, but we actually received that. And that's something that we were curious about, but this is on the upside that we're going to get that. The financial impact is going to be to our benefit. And that ends with a total revenue of 4,338,000. On the expense side, we're going to have increased staffing costs in order to do that service delivery, increased supply cost, additional rental space in order to do these services. But overall, we end on an upside of 86,000 with a surplus. And this is, scenario A, which we might consider a best case scenario, a better case scenario than our current baseline. Scenario B offers the other end of the fears that you might have around programs are going to have to go fully remote, that perhaps there's another wave of COVID, and there's moderate or declining service demand because of this. And so what we see here is they looked at, what would reduced service delivery look like in this situation? And it's a decrease here and a decrease in state contracts as well. And then looks like there's a little bit of a decrease for them in foundation grants as well, that perhaps that the programming grants aren't going to come in as strongly as folks are still remote. And then we see that the expense side, personnel is the same as the baseline, contract service is the same as the baseline. We have reduced supply costs since we're not going to be in person. Occupancy is still the same. And we have reduced volunteer expenses since we're not entertaining volunteers in this situation. So the downside to this situation is a deficit of 134,000, which is like, breathe through that as a leader, that's like not good. The question of whether we have enough reserves and resources to support that kind of deficit comes to mind for me. Thinking about how would we communicate something like this? Are there certain other expenses we would want to pull? Or does this feel like we really need all of this year to even deliver in a remote situation? But at least now we have the numbers and we have this um, numeric understanding of what the financial implication would be. And that's what we offer with scenario planning. It's an opportunity to look at the numbers and express that of some of the things that you're considering or weighing in on your mind around what could happen for the year. The implications of scenario planning is it allows you to engage staff, board, and funders in data-driven conversations about what could happen this year and what do we want to plan for? What are the decisions we may need to make in different situations? Helps you to identify options. By seeing those numbers down, there's maybe other options that come to mind for you around what you could do. And if you end up being in that situation and haven't thought through it ahead of time, it can be difficult to make those decisions, which is what we saw when COVID happened, was that a lot of organizations were not having top of mind for them that a global pandemic might happen. And it's a lot harder to make those decisions without having kind of thought through potential implications. And hopefully this process allows you to do some thoughtful discussions ahead of the things that are top of mind for you. And also just articulating the triggers, like when do we start to see that the things are leading towards scenario B, that not as good situation. And this might be that we're monitoring our revenue and we're seeing like if X% of revenue doesn't arrive by this date, then we're going to cut a certain level of expenses. Or for the individual who's thinking about part-time versus full-time, it might be that too, is like we feel like we want to see how much we have committed to understand if we can make a decision for part-time versus full-time, and putting those numbers down of what does part-time look like for a salary, what does full-time look like for a salary, and would we have enough to cover that in different situations. I'm going to pause here for any questions as we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm going to give a second for folks to weigh in on the chat if there's any questions. And
Yeah, Annie, I'd like to go actually to the very first question that we got at the beginning of the session, because you just talked about employment here. And so we had a question that I'd love to pose to you. We have tried in the past to hire someone for just a few hours a week and we're not successful. What are your thoughts about good parameters for a part-time person? What is enough time/funding to get someone who will last and take the work seriously?
oh, such a great question. And I think that it, well, first of all, would depend on the position that you're trying to hire for. If it is something that would be typically seen as a full-time position, I could see why it's difficult. And I wonder like if there are ways to understand the the most that you could cover for that part-time position. I'll say that typically I haven't seen a lot of folks be able to keep folks on for a while if it's less than half time. Um, but I think that's a really good consideration. I would offer maybe talking to some of the folks who have said that it's not enough and understanding if it's really a personal situation for them or if it's really in the type of work you're asking them to do, that's just typically something that is at a more hours a week. Um, and hopefully that's helpful. I'll say when we model out, we will model out down to like halftime typically for personnel. And then beyond that, it kind of becomes contractors. And I think with um, subcontractors or folks that have a 1099 with you, it can be more difficult because it's not like full employment status. They'd have to have a certain level of um, financial stability to be able to just work hourly and to be able to bill you hourly for that work. So I think it's probably nuanced and dependent on your situation.
Yeah, and I just offer one other thing from our experience at the Mass Cultural Council. We've talked to a couple organizations who have gone in together for a collaborative type of position where there's not enough hours at one place to hire a full-time box office person, perhaps, or a house manager or somebody, but in order to get someone full-time with a pretty good pay, maybe 3 organizations go in together. Usually you're not going to share your development director and your donor list, but this works in other positions where it might be a good idea to share maybe a frontline position or something and offer that full-time employment with a real salary behind it.
That is such a great suggestion, Michael. And I would say the same thing for bookkeepers too, or accounting, finance positions. Those are some of the hardest that we've seen for nonprofits to be able to hire. And I think that idea of going in together so that a really qualified person could have enough hours for that to be a full-time position is a great idea. What other questions folks want to pose? I don't see anything in the chat. I don't know if there's anything from before, Michael, that you wanted to raise.
I think we're all cleared out.
Okay, great. So if you do want to use this tool in more detail, we have a specific recording of and includes a template for this scenario planning kind of Excel model, and it will walk you through that. So I think Sarah just put that in the chat. And just as we close out, wanted to be able to check in on folks. This is a question we ask is maybe if you want to respond in the chat for one of these, we call this head, heart, feet. What did you learn from today's session? How did today's session make you feel? What actions will you take back to your organization leaving this session? But would be welcoming anyone want to check out and share those things in the chat. Upcoming sessions coming up is we are going to be doing all of these sessions, Nonprofit Finance Fund in partnership with MCC. So you can see the whole list of everything that's continuing through June. And I'll say what else is left is around understanding your mission and money mix, managing risks and opportunities, full costs, telling your financial story, and partnerships and collaboration, which hopefully are all things that might give you some additional thoughts as you do your work. The next session on May 25th next week from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern is with my wonderful colleague, Alice Antonelli, who's a super experienced nonprofit finance fund consultant. And she's going to share with you understanding your mission and money mix. And this is really around the trade-offs or the balance, I should say, the balance that we have around the work that brings in the money that we need to sustain our operations and the work that is really mission aligned and oftentimes aren't able to cover its full cost. And how do you do that assessment for yourself and understand what's the right mix for your organization? So hopefully you can join that. And thank you for everyone for all the thoughts around how helpful this tool was. Really hope that it offered some insights for you all. You all are doing the important work and you guys have so much experience, and we're here just to offer some additional thoughts as you do that work. So let Michael know if you have any questions. We're happy to answer too.
Thank you so much, Annie. This is wonderful. And we really appreciate the tool because I think a lot of our folks love something to grab onto and to make their lives easier. So be sure to check out that. As Annie talked about our next upcoming sessions in the NFF series, I'd also like to mention a session that we have this coming Thursday because we do 2 a week. It's one on leadership transitions during COVID and times of stress. So this is when things are really crazy and then you have a leadership transition. How do you go about doing that? So we're going to have a wonderful opportunity to talk to a different firm on Thursday to talk about how we do that. It's an hour session. We cut it down in time because we know our attention spans for webinars are decreasing as we go along. And so we're happy to provide that. And yes, in the chat is the link to the tool that Annie was talking about. So all of you will get the copy of this email, of this video via email when it's ready to go, probably tomorrow. Feel free to share that with anybody on your team that you might feel that this is important to. And stay safe, and we'll see you at the next Mass Culture Council webinar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you, Michael and MCC and Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye-bye.